A little bit of a different kind of patch review video today that I typically do on this channel. The next Marvel Snap patch is slated for Tuesday, January 9th. However, yesterday, Tuesday, January 2nd, when the season rolled over, the patch notes were briefly published early on the official Marvel Snap webpage. They were quickly pulled back down, but obviously, once you put information out there on the internet, it disseminates for everyone to see. So I'm going to go ahead and review what those leaked early published notes covered yesterday. This is an early leak, so it is subject to change and technically not official, even though it was on the official website momentarily. So asterisk, grain of salt, subject to change, all that. Let's go ahead and dive right into what these say to see what we could potentially be expecting in the patch next week. Our first change in this patch looks to be a big one. Loki's getting a pretty sizable adjustment. Now, instead of replacing the contents of your hand with cards from your opponent's starting deck, he now transforms your hand into cards from your opponent's starting deck, and they still get that -1 cost reduction. This change from a replace to transform definitely has one big impact and likely has a second as well, depending on exactly how it's implemented on the back end. The first thing that this certainly changes, as is referenced in the patch notes, is that transforming the cards instead of replacing them means that Loki will now no longer make the collector massive when you get his on reveal trigger. Seconder actually went on to note in these leaked patch notes that Loki wasn't even the most winning card inside of the Loki decks when drawn and played. Collector actually held that title, I would assume in large part due to the fact that when paired with Loki, he scaled up easily into the double digits, and even when he wasn't paired with the deck's namesake, Collector regularly gets to a 2, 5, 6, 7, or sometimes even 8 without a Loki in sight, just how it scales up based on cards like Snowguard and Agent Coulson and others filling up your hand. The second repercussion of this transform as opposed to replace is that I would wager that this means Quinjet is no longer an additional way to discount your Loki'd cards. The cards are from your opponent's deck now, but they were originally things that started in yours, meaning Quinjet condition is no longer met. That being said, things are funky on Marvel Snap's programming backend, and we don't have an official rulebook, so we'll need to wait and see how that plays out exactly. But I do think removing Quinjet's double discount on Loki cards would be another good way to rein in his strength a little bit, so I hope it plays out that way. Finally, it's also worth noting that while Loki's text box is definitely a pretty sizable downgrade with these changes, they did give him a small bump up to a 4/6, where previously he had been a 4/5, so this change isn't a strict downgrade, even if it is going to make the Loki archetype largely worse. Our next change in the leaked patch notes is to another one of Marvel Snap's heavy hitters recently, Miss Marvel. Her new ongoing ability now says your adjacent locations with 2+ cards and no repeated costs have +5 power. Second editor says that overall, while this is a small change in scope, they expect it to have a meaningful impact on the card, which is good. Marvel's become pretty omnipresent in the metagame, I think in no small part due to the fact that she allows you to have meaningful counterplay into Professor X. I'm curious to see if that actually causes her to struggle a little bit, because Professor X decks will still be able to lock out a location knowing they have 2 cards inside of it to hit with Miss Marvel, whereas if you're someone that's hoping to have counterplay to Professor X with your own Miss Marvel, that's going to be more of a struggle since you need to put multiple cards in every location now to get her buff into it later. Second editor also notes that in her initial design, they kind of wanted to have this. You have to have 2 cards as a requirement, but they weren't sure how to cleanly do that inside of her text box without making it too wordy. And I think this current iteration shows that they were able to do that successfully. Our next card getting an adjustment is another one of Marvel Snap's current top performers, and that's Anilist. 2 pretty big changes to this card. The first being its stat line is going from a 5/7 down to a 5/5. The second is that its on reveal will now only switch over cards that have power strictly less than 0 as opposed to less than or equal to, meaning kicking rocks across the board that debris has generated will no longer be nearly as straightforward. Seconder gives a couple of justifications for their changes. The first is that having Anilist include being able to kick rocks blocks across the board from debris was something that they wanted to do initially to make sure the card could have a meaningful impact in a couple different ways. That being said, Anilist's strength with simply Hood and Sentry has proven to be a top metagame force in the live environment, and they think Anilist will likely remain competitive while only focusing on those explicit synergies. Second goes on to comment that Anilist has been one of the most significant outliers in their performance data for weeks now at every level of play, even performing very strong at the top level of play where things typically flatten out a bit with other cards that are overperforming in other places. Our next change in these leaked notes is the first buff or potentially side grade, depending on the situation you're in, from these notes, and that is Dracula is being changed to a 4/1 who now gains the power of the card that you discard from your hand. Second notes that they've been monitoring discard deck's performance in the wake of the America Chavez rework, and Dracula was easily the card that was most damaged by that change. This rework to Dracula makes it so if they need to adjust the card further, they can easily take its base starting power up and down in an OTA update to make it stronger or weaker depending on what the card may need. I did note that this is potentially a side grade because there are some niche situations where this change is worse than before. For example, if your opponent uses something like Hazmat or Spider-Woman, Dracula is going to get his power downgraded, and previously he would reset it based on what you discarded, but now it's just additive with whatever you're bidding at the end of the game. Our next change is a relatively simple buff/rework to one of Marvel Snap's earliest series cards in Angel. Angel now says when one of your cards is destroyed, this flies out of your hand or deck to replace it. Essentially, this allows Angel to get onto the board for free, even if you draw it early, giving you another body to either chew up with another destroy card or just providing a couple of points of stats, the location that you had just cleaned out. This strict upgrade to a card that's otherwise viewed as unplayable seems like a welcome change to the game. I will say I hope M'Baku gets a similar update at some point in the future, though. I honestly think our next buff/redesign has the potential to be the most impactful of all the changes in today's update, likely creating a new format staple. Quake is still a 2/3 whose on reveal now reads swap the position of the other two locations. Changing Quake's ability from something completely random to something that you have precise control over is incredibly powerful. Lots of naturally occurring locations are ones that you can swap to be beneficial to you, something like a Death's Domain or a Sanctum Sanctorum or an Altar of Death being changed when you have priority at a key moment in the game can make or break a lot of outcomes, including on turn 6 when your opponent's committing lots of extra cubes on the line. It's also worth noting that in terms of existing metagame threats, this Quake change is a pretty significant power level downgrade to the card Storm, since you can let them flood a location, build up strength in another, and then flip that flooded to the one where you're ahead, kind of breaking that lockout that your opponent had previously created. The next potential change outline is an interesting one that I personally have some mixed feelings about. Kingpin's getting a complete redesign, going from his previous 3/4 that blows up cards when they moved his location on turn 6 to a 2/3 that says whenever an enemy card moves here, afflict it with -2 power. Second Inner starts out their justification for this change by saying that Kingpin was kind of a loose end from their previous change to cards being face down, moved, and destroyed. Specifically, it was confusing to a lot of players when something like Juggernaut kicked cards into a Kingpin lane and they got destroyed without ever flipping up. This change means that that's something that will no longer happen. It's worth noting that the previous Kingpin iteration wasn't exactly a format powerhouse. It was, generally speaking, always underperforming, and this card needed a change for that reason as well. As for the specific change that's been landed on, I like it for a few reasons. The first is that it has some really express deck building synergy that you can build around yourself. You play Kingpin as a 2-drop on turn 2, and then on turn 3, you can use something like Polaris or Spider-Man to pull an enemy card into his lane, immediately getting value off his effect, effect. If you trigger this Kingpin even a singular time over the course of the game, he ends up being effectively 5 points worth of power for 2 energy, which is above rate for that energy slot, generally speaking. It's also worth noting that this new Kingpin design is asymmetrical, meaning you can play your own movement cards such as Silk alongside him without worrying about much of the downside. Deck idea that jumps to mind, for example, is we have a deck that has Kingpin and Kraven in it, so that way you set up a thing where no matter which lane your Spider-Man jumps to with his friend, you're going to end up getting some kind of bonus on your side because you benefit no matter which lane your opponent's things are moving into. All in all, I think if the patch ends up going live verbatim as these leak notes describe it, it's mostly a win overall. They adjusted Lockdown indirectly thanks to Miss Marvel getting adjusted, as well as Quake giving us a new way to fight Storm. Loki as well as Anilist are cards that a lot of players have been clamoring for changes to for a while now, and those are definitely downgrades to both of those. I think the one kind of outlier in my mind that doesn't get touched by this patch is Blob, but I'm also not surprised that Blob doesn't have changes here. Remember, they lock in changes for these patches, generally speaking, a month in advance, so Blob had barely been released when they shipped everything that we're seeing in this patch for January 9th. Overall, I'd love to know your thoughts on this rundown here today, as well as if you like me covering leaked stuff like this on the channel. If you enjoyed my musings on the topic, be sure to snap that like button, help this video reach some more people, and hopefully we'll see you back again real soon for more excellent Marvel Snap content here on YouTube.